My name is Grace Walker. I'm 33 years old, and I'm an architect living in New York. I'm also the youngest partner at one of the biggest sustainable design firms in the city. But if you'd been at my father's retirement gala that night in Boston, you never would have known it. That night, every single detail was perfect, at least from the outside. There were towering white floral centerpieces on every round table, soft jazz from a live band, and a guest list that seemed to cover every influential person in the city's construction world. The room buzzed with conversations and clinking glasses. My family sat at the front, next to the stage. I sat alone at a table near the back, next to a couple of second cousins I barely remembered from childhood. The air in that ballroom felt heavy with expectation, maybe because everyone knew my father, Marcus Walker, wasn't just any CEO. He was the man who built Walker Development Group from nothing, who could dominate a room with his presence. I knew what kind of night this would be, but I still found myself hoping, even as I watched my two older brothers chat and laugh at the main table with him. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me kept waiting for something, anything, a nod in my direction, a smile that felt real. I wanted to believe that tonight would be different, that maybe finally he'd see me for who I am. But it's funny how hope works. Sometimes it refuses to leave even when it's been shut out 100 times before. When the program started, I folded my hands in my lap and tried to focus on the speeches and the stories that filled the room. People stood and talked about my father's vision, his grit, the legacy he built, and how much they admired his sons. With each passing minute, my seat felt colder, my hands tighter around the box I had brought my gift for him. The same gift I'd agonized over for weeks, wondering if it would mean anything at all. I watched my brothers take the stage, their voices full of pride. They thanked Dad for all the lessons, for teaching them what it meant to lead. My father smiled at them, the kind of smile that seemed to light up his whole face. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself this was his night, and I shouldn't expect anything. Then he took the microphone. The applause was so loud it almost drowned out his voice, but not quite. He talked about sacrifice, about building something that would last beyond him, about the importance of having someone strong enough to carry on what he'd started. Then, in front of hundreds of people, he said something that I don't think I'll ever forget. He said, "My sons have what it takes. I only wish my daughter did too." A few people glanced over at me. Most just kept clapping. The truth is, I've heard worse. But sitting there with the spotlight on everything, I felt like I was 8 years old again, desperate for his approval. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I sat perfectly still, my chin up, my eyes dry. I reached for the box by my feet, the box I'd spent days filling with pieces of my life he never wanted to see. Inside were my diplomas, my first published article, the blueprints for my award-winning project, even a letter from my mother written before she died. I wrapped it all in navy paper and tied it with silver ribbon. I told myself it was just a gesture, but really it was a plea, a last silent ask for him to see me. That's when I realized that night wasn't about making him proud. It was about showing myself I had nothing left to hide. I wish I could say that handing him that box felt like a victory. It didn't. Not at first. It felt like ripping the last bit of hope out of myself and putting it on display. But sometimes you have to risk being seen for who you truly are, even if you're terrified of what comes next. If you've ever sat in a room full of people and felt invisible, carried around the weight of someone else's expectations, maybe you'll understand what I'm about to share. This is the story of the night my father called me a failure, and what happened when I finally showed him the truth. Growing up in the Walker household felt like living in a world where the rules had been set long before I arrived. My father, Marcus Walker, ran his construction empire like a general commands an army. There was order, discipline, and this constant sense that every move we made was somehow building toward a bigger legacy. My brothers Daniel and Chris were 6 and 4 years older than I. From as early as I can remember, they were always right by his side, learning how to read blueprints, asking about contracts at the dinner table, following him to job sites on the weekends. It was like they had been handed a map to the Walker future, and I was left somewhere in the margins. My mother Evelyn tried to carve out space for me that wasn't just a reflection of my father's world. She had been an art teacher before she met him. Our house was filled with her watercolours, and pottery, tiny signs of gentleness in a place that valued concrete and steel. She'd let me help her in the garden on Sunday mornings, our hands deep in soil talking about colour and texture while the boys watched football with Dad inside. Those moments are still clear in my mind, the smell of grass and clay, the sunlight hitting her hair, the way she'd listen to me as if I were the only person on earth. But once the door to the house swung open and my father's voice filled the hallway, the whole energy shifted. The conversations changed. At dinner, the talk was always about Walker development, about the next big contract, which city they might build. In next what Daniel or Chris had learned at the office that week. Whenever I tried to ask a question or bring up something from school, the room would pause for a second, then pivot back to business as usual. I learned to read the signals. My job was to listen to clear plates and to laugh at the right moments. Sometimes I'd look at my mother, hoping she'd pull me in, but most of the time she'd just give me a soft smile, a silent apology for something she couldn't change. There was a particular Thanksgiving when I was 8 that stands out in my memory. Dad had invited his business partner and their family. The men clustered in the living room, talking in low voices about a zoning deal. I tried to listen in, fascinated by the maps and numbers. When I asked what a variance was, my father glanced at me, almost amused, and said, "Grace, why don't you go help your mother set the table? This is grown-up talk." That was the first time I felt truly invisible, not just ignored but pushed out by design. School was the only place I felt like I belonged. I loved math and science, but I also loved drawing, especially the way buildings fit together. In 3rd grade, I won first place in the regional STEM fair for a model of a green city. My mother cheered like I'd just won the Olympics. My father barely looked up from his laptop when I brought the ribbon home. "That's nice," he said. "But what about your math grade?" When the local newspaper came to interview me about the project, I told the reporter, she gets her creativity from her mother. The real money's in engineering, not art. As I got older, the gap between me and my brothers grew even wider. They went with Dad to job sites every summer, wore hard hats and boots that were too big for them, and learned to shake hands like little men. I stayed home and helped my mother at the community art centre. She let me organise the supply room and paint the old clay pots to brighten up the lobby. Sometimes I'd hear my father sigh when he walked by, shaking his head at our mess. "One of these days you'll have to find something real to do," he'd say, not unkindly, but with the finality of a closed door. By high school, it was clear the family path didn't include me. Daniel was already taking college business classes on weekends. Chris was helping draft contracts after school. When I won a state math competition, the school principal sent a letter home. Dad hung it on the fridge for a week, then replaced it with an article about a big Walker development deal in the city paper. Every achievement I brought home felt like a pebble tossed into a lake. It barely left a ripple. Still, my mother never stopped believing in me. She'd save my certificates and ribbons in a big manila envelope she kept in her closet. "These are your foundations," she'd say, as we filed them away together. She encouraged me to take an architecture class at the local college the summer I turned 15. That was when I first felt a spark seeing how math design and engineering could fit together. I started sketching buildings at night, filling entire notebooks with ideas for parks, schools, and homes. I'd show them to my mother, and she'd study every detail like it mattered. My father, on the other hand, saw my new passion as a passing phase. When I announced that I wanted to be an architect, he shook his head and said, "That's not a real job, Grace. That's for dreamers, not leaders." At dinner, he'd asked Daniel about the latest financial news, and Chris about the progress of their family business internships. With me, he stuck to safe topics like the weather, or what I planned to do with all that drawing. He'd tell his friends at parties, "Our daughter's the creative one," with a tone that sounded like both pride and disappointment. Looking back, I can see how much I wanted his approval. I tried everything I could think of, joining the debate team, picking up extra math credits, even learning basic coding, so I could talk to Daniel about his business analytics class. But no matter what I did, it never quite measured up. My brothers would tease me about my notebooks, but it didn't sting the way my father's silence did. There was a night during my sophomore year when the difference between us was so sharp it felt like a cut. Dad brought home blueprints for a massive city park redevelopment project. The boys gathered around the kitchen island, excitedly pointing out roads and pavilions. I hovered at the edge, clutching my notebook, my hands sweating. When I finally built up the nerve to share a design for a playground that I'd spent weeks on, my father glanced at it for half a second, then handed it back. "That's cute, honey. Maybe your mother can hang it up in her studio." I went up to my room that night and cried. Not because he didn't like my drawing, but because it was clear he'd never see me the way he saw my brothers. The next morning, my mother found me sketching before school and sat beside me without saying anything. She just placed her hand on mine, squeezed it gently, and whispered, "Don't stop dreaming, Grace. The world needs more people like you." Her words became my shield in the years that followed. Even as I kept getting shuffled to the sidelines at family gatherings, school events, or just around our dinner table, I learned to find small pieces of happiness in places my father didn't look. It wasn't enough to erase the hurt, but it kept me moving forward one sketch at a time. If I close my eyes now, I can still feel my mother's presence, steady and kind, reminding me that being different wasn't something to be fixed. It was something to be proud of, even if I had to fight for every inch of it. I spent most of high school planning my escape. I worked hard in every class, driven not just by ambition, but by the quiet certainty that getting out was the only way I could breathe. My father was proud when my brothers got into Ivy League schools for business and law, but when I announced I'd won a scholarship to MIT for architecture, he just nodded and told me not to waste it. His words stung, but I used the pain to push myself harder. If I couldn't have his approval, maybe I could find something close in the outside world. The first time I felt truly seen was my second year at MIT when my team won the National Sustainable Futures Design Competition. I'd spent weeks in the studio barely sleeping, obsessed with creating a model that blended affordable housing with green technology. When the jury called our project visionary, I couldn't wait to call home. My mum's voice was thick with pride. My father wasn't there when I called. Later that night, I found out he had skipped my award ceremony entirely to attend a trade dinner with my brothers in Chicago. It was the first time my absence from the family made perfect sense to him. Each time I reached a new milestone, the pattern repeated. The harder I worked, the more isolated I felt. When I graduated, MIT asked me to give the commencement address for the School of Architecture. I wrote my speech late into the night, crafting it with care, hoping this might finally be the moment Dad would look at me and see someone he could respect. My mother reserved seats for the family near the front. That morning, my father arrived 20 minutes late, missing the speech, and left immediately after the ceremony, muttering something about Daniel's meeting with investors. I stood on the stage, diploma in hand, scanning the crowd for him, and felt a hollow sort of pride. I tried not to let it get to me, but the wounds ran deeper every year. After college, I landed an entry-level job at a boutique firm in New York. My focus was always on sustainable urban design. I wanted to build spaces that made life better for people, that could last without hurting the planet. My mother told everyone she knew about my new job. My father sent me a curt email. "Congrats! Let me know if you change your mind about working at Walker Development." I started staying quiet during family calls, letting my brothers talk about their promotions and business trips. I told myself it didn't matter if he never cared about what I was building, but I would have given anything for him to ask a single real question. My career took off faster than I expected. I was promoted twice in 2 years, then recruited by a top firm to lead a new project, redesigning an entire waterfront neighborhood using green energy and public spaces. We won the State Innovation Award that year. The ceremony was downtown in a glass tower that looked out over the city lights. My mother flew in, beaming from the front row. My father said he couldn't make it because of a last-minute contract negotiation. He sent flowers with a card signed by his assistant. The people around me celebrated, but inside I felt like a ghost at my party. That same year, Walker Development was featured in the city paper. There was a full-page spread about the company's next generation, complete with photos and quotes from Daniel and Chris. The story praised their vision and leadership. My name wasn't mentioned, even though one of my designs had just been selected for a public-private partnership with the city. When I saw the article, I read it twice, waiting for some small sign of recognition. There was nothing. I showed the piece to my mother, who shook her head and hugged me tight. I tried to laugh it off, but later that night I cried so hard my chest ached. All those moments, missed ceremonies, skipped speeches, silent articles pushed me to work harder. Every time I felt invisible at home, I looked for ways to prove myself somewhere else. I networked, took on projects nobody else wanted, and volunteered to mentor younger architects. My name started to appear in trade journals and on awards lists. People in my field respected me, but that need for approval never really faded. I kept thinking that if I did just a little more, I could finally win his respect. It was during this whirlwind that I met Sam. He was consulting for our firm on team communication and mental health, a former corporate psychologist with a gentle way of asking questions that made people open up. He had sandy hair, a calm laugh, and eyes that seemed to see straight through any defenses. We started talking after a stressful project review. I was venting about work, but the conversation quickly turned personal. He didn't flinch when I admitted that sometimes I felt like an imposter, no matter how many accolades I collected. He told me he'd seen the same thing in people twice my age. Recognition from others can be powerful, he said, but the real shift happens when you stop needing it. Sam and I began dating. For the first time, I felt what it was like to be known without having to prove myself. He listened when I talked about my work, asked follow-up questions, and never pretended to understand things he didn't. He saw value in the way I saw the world, and he never dismissed my ambition as a phase or a quirk. On quiet nights, I would confess how badly I still wanted my father's respect, even when I told myself I didn't care. Sam would remind me that longing for approval wasn't a flaw. "You're human," he said. "You just want your story to matter to the people who should love you most." Sometimes I wondered what it would feel like to let go of that need, to stop chasing someone who never turned around. But every time I thought I'd moved on, another milestone would bring the ache right back. At work, people saw me as strong, determined, and even fearless. But inside, I was always measuring my worth against an invisible yardstick. If Dad ever noticed, he never said so. He'd send occasional texts about the weather or the market, nothing about my life or career. The gap between us became a permanent part of my landscape. There were times when my frustration bubbled over, but I never confronted him directly. I was afraid of what he'd say, or worse, that he wouldn't care at all. My mother always tried to soften things, sending photos of my projects to family group chats, or leaving my awards out on the mantel for everyone to see when my father came home. Sometimes he'd glance at them and nod. Sometimes he'd say nothing at all. The years kept moving. My portfolio grew, my confidence on the job soared, but that empty spot in my chest never quite filled in. I learned to hide it well. On the outside, I was Grace Walker, architect innovator, young leader to watch. On the inside, I was still a girl sitting at the edge of the kitchen island, holding her drawing, wishing for someone to look up and see her. Sam helped me begin to accept that my father's view of me might never change, and that didn't have to define who I was. He showed me that I could build a life with or without his blessing, that my success was real even if it was invisible at home. There was comfort in that, even as I kept hoping for a day when it wouldn't matter anymore. I'd love to say that recognition from the outside world erased the pain of being overlooked at home. But the truth is, every honor felt a little bit hollow when the person I most wanted to impress didn't even notice. My ambition was a shield and a wound at the same time. It drove me forward, but it also kept me tied to a story I wasn't sure I could ever rewrite. Looking back now, I see how each disappointment shaped me, not just as an architect, but as a person. I became someone who paid attention to the people others overlooked. I learned how to listen, how to find possibilities where others saw nothing, how to create spaces that felt like belonging. I know now that those gifts came from being on the outside, from learning how to see myself even when others refused to look. But back then, all I wanted was a single moment when my father would turn and finally say, "I am proud of you." The invitation arrived on a Thursday, sandwiched between utility bills and a glossy architecture magazine. The envelope was thick, cream-coloured, with my father's name embossed in heavy silver on the flap. I held it for a minute before opening it, my stomach tightening at the weight of those familiar letters. Inside was the announcement of his retirement, gala black tie. Boston hundreds of guests, expected speeches from family and friends. The RSVP card almost slipped from my hand as I read the details again, thinking of all the nights I'd spent imagining what this moment would feel like. Sam found me at the kitchen counter, an invitation still in my hand. "You don't have to go," he said, softly, reading the tension in my shoulders. My best friend Julia called that evening, her voice sharp with concern. "You know how this goes, Grace. Are you sure you want to put yourself through it again?" I told them both I wasn't sure, but the truth was I already knew I'd go. Some wounds have to be faced head-on, no matter how many times they split open. The days leading up to my decision felt thick with anxiety. I made lists in my head of reasons to stay away, then lists for why I should go. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe hope, but part of me needed to see it through. I thought about what I would wear, about how I'd walk into that ballroom and hold my head up high no matter where they seated me. Late at night, I practiced what I'd say if given the chance. I knew there was a good chance I'd regret it, but I also knew I couldn't run from this forever. Packing for Boston. I folded my best suit into my bag and slipped the gift box into a corner beneath my clothes. It felt like arming myself with every ounce of courage I had left. I told myself that even if the night ended in silence, I'd walk out knowing I'd chosen to show up for myself. There was fear, but under it a flicker of something almost like hope. Maybe this would be the night something finally changed. The ballroom glittered under hundreds of tiny crystal lights, casting everything in a soft, almost surreal glow. Waiters moved in quiet lines between round tables covered with navy linen, each centerpiece stacked high with white lilies and blue hydrangeas. I stood near the back for a moment, letting the sound of distant laughter and the scent of expensive cologne settle around me. The air was thick with old money and expectation. Most of the guests were people I'd seen at company holidays or distant family weddings, all with the same practiced smiles. Their greetings felt brief, their questions perfunctory. "Still in architecture. Your dad must be proud. Daniel and Chris are just killing it, huh?" Their words always drifted back to my brothers as if I were just a pleasant side note. I found my seat at a table toward the far wall, next to cousins who talked about their own kids, never asking about mine. From my vantage point, I could see my father at the head table, his posture perfect, flanked by Daniel and Chris and their wives. Occasionally he glanced my way, his gaze unreadable. Every detail in the room spoke to his success, from the gold-lettered banners to the wall of photos, showing Walker Development's rise over 40 years. But none of those images included me. As the servers brought out the first course, my appetite disappeared. I let the conversation flow around me, clinging to my glass of water, as if it could anchor me. After dinner, the lights dimmed, and a video screen dropped from the ceiling. The tribute montage began with black and white snapshots of my father, as a young man, sleeves rolled up, laughing with construction crews. It shifted to colour groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings, handshakes with mayors. The family section followed my brothers, as toddlers with hard hats, helping Dad turn over shovels of dirt, standing beside him at grand openings. There were photos of Daniel's wedding, Chris's business award holiday ski trips, their faces always shining beside his. I waited for a glimpse of myself. There was one shot of me at about 10, lost in the corner of a big family portrait. The rest of the slideshow played on without me. People clapped politely as the video ended. I tried to join in, but my hands felt numb. The CFO spoke next, his remarks peppered with inside jokes about my brother's deals and Dad's legendary work ethic. My father's longtime assistant praised his mentorship of the next generation. No one mentioned my name. When it was time for family speeches, Daniel and Chris stood side by side, their words warm and easy. They thanked Dad for believing in them, for teaching them the meaning of hard work and vision. I nodded along my face, a practice mask, wishing for the room to spin a little slower. Finally, my father stood. The applause that greeted him filled every corner of the ballroom. He straightened his jacket, let the noise die down, then started to speak in his familiar, commanding tone. He told stories about starting the business in a rented garage, the risks he'd taken, the deals he'd made. He talked about the values he hoped to pass down, how proud he was of the men his sons had become. He described Daniel's leadership in the company's latest expansion, Chris's creativity in bringing new clients on board. He smiled at them, a smile that belonged to a father, certain of his legacy. Then he paused, letting the silence hang just long enough to draw every eye. He glanced around the room, his gaze sweeping over me and then past me. A man builds, a man leads, A man leaves something behind for others to carry forward, he said. I'm lucky to have 2 sons who embody those values. The audience nodded and murmured their agreement. He took a breath, then added, Not everyone is cut out for this world. Some people are better suited to different paths. The way he said it, with a small wave of his hand, felt colder than any outright insult. I could feel the eyes on me flickers of sympathy, from those who understood careful avoidance from everyone else. He wrapped up with a toast to the future, to family, to Walker Development's continued growth. The applause started again, a tidal wave that seemed to push me further into my chair. I smiled for the sake of the people watching, but inside I felt myself shrinking. My father had erased me in front of everyone who ever mattered to him, and in that moment, I wondered if I had ever really existed in his story at all. I stood up so quietly that the chair barely made a sound. The room stilled as if someone had pressed pause on the entire night. My heels clicked against the ballroom floor, each step echoing as I crossed the space between my table and the stage. My father looked down at me, surprise flickering across his face, then hardening into something unreadable. I held out the box wrapped in navy and silver, my hand steady. Congratulations, Dad, I said, keeping my voice clear. I brought you something. It's from your biggest disappointment. Please open it when I'm gone. He didn't reach for it right away, caught between pride and confusion, but I set the box in front of him, forcing his hand. All around us, people watched with wide eyes, whispers breaking the hush like static. I didn't let myself look at Daniel or Chris. My shoulders were back. I turned and walked off the stage without waiting for his answer. For the first time all night, I felt taller than anyone in that room. The air in the lobby felt cold compared to the heat of the ballroom. I walked outside, the city lights spinning in my vision, my breath quick and shaky. The first thing I did was silence my phone, but I could still feel it buzzing in my purse, message after message piling up. By the time I reached my hotel room, I was too tired to cry. I sat on the bed still in my suit shoes, tossed to the floor, just listening to the quiet. I finally checked my phone. There were messages from both my brothers. Daniel. What did you put in that box, Chris? Are you okay? Dad looks like he's in shock. Sam's name popped up with a single line. I'm proud of you, Grace. Call me if you need to talk. I read his words over and over. For the first time in hours, I let myself breathe a little easier, though the ache in my chest lingered. I wanted to reply, but I didn't know what to say yet. In the ballroom, the mood had shifted. My father stood alone at the front, the box on the table before him, his hands clumsy as he untied the ribbon and peeled away the paper. People pretended not to watch, but every head was turned in his direction. He opened the box and pulled out my diplomas, the program for my first solo exhibition, and photos of buildings with my name etched in the cornerstones. He lifted the letter from my mother, its paper worn from being folded and unfolded over the years. For a long moment he didn't move. His face lost that proud, rigid mask he wore so easily. He read my mother's words slowly, lips pressed tight, eyes bright with something I hadn't seen in years. I pictured all of it from my hotel window, the city stretching out below. The distance between us felt both endless and somehow necessary. My father had spent a lifetime building walls between us, but there, under the white glare of the chandeliers, those walls had finally cracked. Maybe he saw for the first time what I'd built without his blessing. I hoped the evidence of my life forced him to ask questions he'd never bothered to consider. The possibility brought a strange sense of relief, heavy but clean. Alone in my room, I felt hollowed out, but also oddly free. The exhaustion went deeper than muscle or bone, but beneath it was a new steadiness. I curled up under the covers, the city sounds muffled by heavy glass. My phone buzzed again, another gentle nudge from Sam. I didn't answer, but this time I smiled. I closed my eyes, replaying the scene in my head. My father opened that box. The truth finally laid out in a place he couldn't ignore. I fell asleep before sunrise, not sure if I had lost something or finally found it. The grief lingered, sharp and aching, but so did the beginning of something else, healing maybe, or the slow, quiet return of hope. For the first time in years, I didn't dream about being enough. I just dreamed about being seen. The week after the gala moved slowly every hour, thick with the aftermath of everything that had been said and left unsaid. I threw myself into work, avoiding calls from family and even Sam needing space to sort through the tangle of anger and exhaustion that clung to me. On Wednesday morning, I found an email in my inbox from my father. The subject line was just my name. Inside the message was short. I saw everything you put in the box. I was wrong. I'm sorry. If you're willing, I'd like your input on a new project, a community centre for your mother's old neighbourhood. I read it twice, not sure what to believe. My father had never apologised before, not for anything. The idea that he wanted my opinion, or even cared enough to reach out, felt almost unreal. Still, there was something in the tone, plain and direct, without his usual edge, that made me pause. Part of me wanted to hit delete and move on. Another part couldn't help but wonder if this was what change looked like in real time, awkward, tentative, imperfect. A few days later, a package arrived at my door with blueprints inside. The plans were rough scrawled, with questions about sustainable materials and design. In the margin was a note in my father's hand. "I am learning. Would appreciate your thoughts." It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was honest. I sat at my kitchen table, tracing the lines with my finger, feeling the old skepticism flicker against a strange new hope. My father hadn't just said he was sorry, he was trying to prove it, step by step, blueprint by blueprint. I drafted a reply. My words were careful but open. I told him what I liked about his ideas and where he could improve. I offered to meet and talk through the project in person. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, I let myself imagine a future where the space between us could be filled with something other than silence. Our first meeting about the community centre took place at a quiet coffee shop by the river, a space I had chosen for its light and openness. My father arrived right on time. His suit pressed, but something about him seemed smaller, almost cautious. We spread out the blueprints between us, the paper catching sunlight on the little table, and for a while we just talked about logistics and materials. He listened in a way I had never experienced before. When he didn't understand a concept, he asked questions instead of dismissing it. I caught myself relaxing, even laughing once or twice, as we debated the best way to bring daylight into the main hall. Those first few weeks were awkward. I was used to holding my guard up around him, waiting for a jab or a brush-off. Instead, he began emailing articles about green design, sometimes with a note. "Saw this and thought of you." One evening, after a long day on site, he sent a photo of himself in a hard hat next to a pile of reclaimed wood with the caption, "Trying to see it your way." I started to believe he was really trying to change, not just for the project, but for our relationship. We met every week, sometimes more. Each time our conversations shifted further from surface-level planning to real, thoughtful exchanges. I showed him how to read building performance reports, and he told stories about the challenges he faced starting Walker development. He asked for my opinion on hiring local artists for the centre's murals. The first time he deferred to my decision in front of the project team, I almost didn't believe it. There was a respect in his voice that had never been there before. After the third week, my brothers joined us for dinner at Daniel's place. The tension in the room was sharp at first. Chris made a joke about the new dynamic, and Daniel watched me waiting to see if I would snap. Instead, my father spoke up. "Grace is leading design. Listen to her." Both brothers seemed stunned. Later, Daniel pulled me aside and said, "He's different lately. I think he's really listening." I wanted to believe it. Part of me still waited for the other shoe to drop, but with every meeting, that old fear lost a little more power. Family therapy started soon after. It was my mother's idea, something she'd left in her letter. We met with a gentle grey-haired therapist in a small office with a view of the park. Those sessions were hard at first, full of old grievances and stubborn silences. My father apologised for things I had long since buried. Sometimes he stumbled over the words, but I saw how much he meant them. My brothers talked about feeling pressure too, how they had envied my freedom without understanding its cost. For the first time, we said things we had all been afraid to say out loud. At work at the community centre, my father kept showing up. He brought coffee for the team, took notes during meetings, and asked every contractor for feedback. One day, he admitted he had no idea how to design a playground for children with disabilities, so he joined me for a tour of another inclusive centre. I watched him listen to the parents there, ask questions, and take notes. That moment was when I knew something fundamental had shifted. He was willing to be a student, not just a leader. With each step, trust began to rebuild slowly and sometimes painfully. There were days when old habits reared up, when he would forget to check with me before making a decision or bristle at criticism. But instead of shutting down, we talked it through. I learned to voice what I needed without fearing it would be ignored. He learned that sometimes the best way to lead was to let someone else take the reins. As the design took shape, we spent late nights in my apartment sketching ideas and ordering takeout. My father confessed that he'd kept a box of my old drawings in his office, though he'd never shown them to anyone. I told him about all the times I'd wanted to quit all the ways I had built a life in the spaces his approval couldn't reach. We found common ground in our differences, recognizing that what had kept us apart could now bring us together. By the time construction began, the community centre felt like more than just a project. It was a testament to growth, to the way people can change if they are brave enough to try. My brothers offered help where they could, and for the first time, we worked as a team, each with a different role, but united by something real. At therapy, we still had hard conversations, but now there was laughter mixed in with the tears. When the first wall went up, my father surprised me by inviting the whole family for a tour. He stood back, letting me explain the features to the city officials, smiling quietly as I described the project's goals. Later he told me he was proud not in a showy way, but simply and directly the way I had always needed to hear. I carried those words with me through every challenge that followed. Working together did not erase the past, but it gave us a way forward. Each blueprint, each decision became a new chance to build trust, to make room for respect. Our story wasn't perfect, but it was ours, messy, hopeful, and stronger for every step we took side by side. The morning of the community centre's opening felt almost unreal. Sunlight streamed through the new glass entryway, casting sharp patterns on the polished floor. People gathered in clusters, laughter and conversation filling every corner. I stood near the main doors, heart pounding, watching families explore the spaces we had poured so much into. Old neighbours hugged each other by the playground. Volunteers gave tours of the classrooms and gardens. For a moment, I let myself simply breathe it all in. When it was time for the speeches, the mayor called my name. My legs felt shaky as I walked to the podium, but I steadied myself by looking at the building itself. The bright murals, the open halls, the rooftop garden we'd fought to include. I thanked the team, the city, and the community for trusting us with their dreams. Then I spoke about value, how it isn't found in numbers or awards, but in the way a space welcomes every person no matter who they are. I told the crowd how my mother had taught me to notice small details and how my father's determination had shaped every plan we made. I looked out at my family gathered in the front row and felt the weight of every year that had brought us here. I shared how hard it can be to ask for respect, especially from those you love, and how easy it is to miss what's right in front of you. The air in the room changed, softening as I spoke. True value, I said, is being seen for who you are and building spaces. Families, friendships, futures where everyone belongs. As I finished, my father stood up and came to the podium. For a heartbeat, I wasn't sure what would happen. Then he took the microphone and turned to face the room, his voice clear and strong. I want to thank my daughter Grace for showing all of us what really matters. She built this place not just with her hands, but with her heart. She taught me that real leadership means listening, learning, and letting others shine. There was a pause, and then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small cardboard model, a house with a rooftop garden, its edges worn but still intact. He held it up for everyone to see. Grace made this when she was 7, he said. I kept it all these years because even then, I knew she had vision. I just didn't know how to see it. He placed the model in my hands, and I felt something shift deep inside. In that instant, the years of silence and misunderstanding faded. What mattered now was the new ground we stood on together. After the ceremony, people stopped to shake my hand, to share stories, to tell me how the centre would change lives. My brothers hugged me, their pride, easy and genuine. My father stood at my side, not in front of or above me, but as my equal. I realised then that reconciliation wasn't about pretending the past had never happened. It was about building something better on top of it, layer by layer, moment by moment. Looking around at the families moving through the centre, I saw echoes of my own journey, each person carrying hopes, hurts, and the need to be seen. I understood now that the truest kind of respect is earned, not given, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is stand our ground and show the world exactly who we are. As sunlight spilled across the new floors, I felt not just proud but whole. I knew at last that I was seen not just as someone's daughter, but as the architect of my own story.